Hello and welcome. I will be reading the interview Aidan Kearney had with a juror from the Massachusetts versus Karen Reed trial. I will leave the link to the website in the description below. I cropped segments from the interview to avoid all of the ads on the website. There are many. And you can avoid the ads by subscribing to the website. I don't have that subscription, so I will just be reading the segments I cropped from the website. It reads, 2 weeks ago, I received an email from someone claiming to be a juror in the Karen Reed trial. I was immediately skeptical, as there is no shortage of degenerates who would spend their days pretending to be a juror in order to feed me misinformation to see if I'd report it, in the hopes that it would damage my reputation. This juror said a couple things about clothing they were wearing and other context clues that helped identify them, but Paul O'Keefe and various McAlberts got to see the same jurors I did, so I wasn't convinced yet. Luckily, this alleged juror agreed to FaceTime me, and when I answered the phone, I was staring back at a face that I spent 10 weeks looking at. This juror agreed to speak with me under the condition of anonymity. They are very afraid of being doxxed and attacked by the anti-Karen Reed mob, but wanted to share with me what they could without giving up information that could make it easier to identify who they were. I sent them a list of almost 40 questions, most of which they answered. However, the one thing most people want to know about is something they don't feel comfortable talking about yet, specifics of juror deliberations. That may change as time passes, but for now I was able to ask what I could, and they answered they could. I think there was a typo. After the trial, I did a lot of catching up across multiple platforms and sources and realized, I think I missed a question. Okay, this was the first question. Why did you decide to come forward and speak with Turtle Boy of all media outlets? And it reads, after the trial, I did a lot of catching up across multiple platforms and sources and realized the way news is reported has changed exponentially over the years. No longer from mainstream media alone. You are a gritty and unshakable journalist despite being perceived as a bit rough around the edges. Above all, you seem to genuinely care about the truth. That was the driving force behind my decision. And just pulling away from the interview, this is what the juror answered. And I will agree in that when I first heard about Aidan Kearney and I watched a few of his videos, a few of his live streams, I felt that, there was some roughness to him, but I'm also rough. It might be a Massachusetts thing, being a resident of Massachusetts, in that people here around here are in the rat race. People in Massachusetts, you just have to drive on Massachusetts highways to know what I'm talking about. The rat race here is alive and well, and it is toxic. And I think it does make people around here rougher around the edges, myself included. I have lived at various parts of the U.S., and since living here for the last several years, there is a stark difference between how people drive around here compared to anywhere else I've lived. People are always in a hurry around here. People are hustling constantly around here. And surely it's the cost of living. The cost of living here has worsened. They are essentially like pushing the poor people out of Massachusetts, and they want just all the corporate money, all the big business money. They don't really care about middle class anymore. Massachusetts wants millionaires, essentially. And that's making the middle class and the poorer classes work harder just to get by. And that does have an effect on the psyche, on the collective psyche in any community, when people are under high pressure to get by. And then in the midst of all of that in the midst of just having the bare basics to survive in the Massachusetts. On top of that, you have a very corrupt system of justice here, so-called justice, that in and of itself, the politicians around here are okay with the gentrification. They are okay with getting paid by the corporations who are purchasing land, purchasing properties, and erecting skyscraper apartments that no one can afford. There are so many brand new apartment buildings in Massachusetts that no one is living in. Just so you guys know. So I'm just saying, people in Massachusetts are generally rough around the edges, myself included. And it's a way of having to adapt to the toxic nature of how a lot of people live in this state. You know, there are people living here that don't have to work very much, but those people are millionaires. For the most part, a majority of people living in Massachusetts have to work very hard. They have to hustle. And that's how I kind of perceive Aidan Kearney. He's after the truth, but he has to hustle. And next question. Had you ever heard of this trial prior to being called for jury duty? The answer is, I'm sure I heard about it when it happened, but it seemed to be another story like any others you see on the news. I didn't pay more attention to this than I did anything else. Next question. When you got jury duty that day, were you aware that the Reed case was picking a jury? The answer is, I was aware they were picking the jury, but was still surprised when I was chosen from the hundreds of people they brought in during jury selection. Next question. Where did you park and what time did you have to get there every day? The answer is, we reported each day at 8:30 a.m. and took the bus to arrive for the 9 a.m. start time. I am not going to disclose the location. I assume this location may be used for upcoming trials and it's not fair to future jurors. That's a really good answer. Next question. Did jurors have a chance to converse socially during the trial? What sort of things did you guys talk about? Did anyone ever discuss the case? The answer is, we never discussed the case. We spent a lot of time together during bus rides, lunch, and breaks, and tried to maintain some normalcy during this very different time in our lives. Our conversations were social, like you would have with anyone you spent time with, discussing how the weekend was, things we had going on outside of court, etc. The next question reads, did jurors see protesters assembling outside the court every day? The answer is, there were times we could hear them or catch a glimpse from the bus, but we couldn't see everything going on outside. Next question. How hard was it not to go home and read this case? Did you have to just stay off the internet and not watch TV at all? The answer is, to be honest, it wasn't that difficult. I went into this completely impartial. I felt my job as a juror was to ensure that Karen got a fair trial where only the facts and evidence were considered versus information from outside sources. I took my job very seriously. Karen's life was at stake, and she deserved the benefit of not having outside information or opinions cloud my judgment. I'm stopping it there because I just want to say, that's a perfect juror to have. And unfortunately, it's difficult to find jurors like that, even with all of their questioning, even with all the process that goes into selecting jury members before a trial. I still feel like people can pretend, people can lie, they can answer questions how they know you want them answered. And then when they finally get into the jury, they're screwing justice over. They're screwing the fate of the person, of the accused, over. Whereas this juror seems to be like what the system was designed for. The system was designed to have jurors who were impartial, to have objective people looking into the case, observing the facts and the evidence, and coming to an objective conclusion. That's what the jury system was designed for. But so often, people become jurors who shouldn't be jurors. And I'm just saying, this person, he or she, I'm grateful that they were a juror for the Karen Reed case, despite the mistrial. Next question. Were jurors made aware that I was kicked out of court for most McAlbert testimony? The answer is no. Interesting. The next question reads, were you made aware that jurors would not be receiving transcripts during deliberations and would have to rely on their notes? The answer is yes. We were told at the beginning of the trial that no transcripts of testimony would be available, and we would need to rely on our notes during deliberations. The next question reads, what did you think of John's mother crying during the trial? Did it seem to influence you or any other jurors? The answer is, I felt immense empathy for both the O'Keefe and Reed families. The death of a loved one is not something anyone ever wants to go through, and their emotions throughout the trial were at times heartbreaking to see. While I didn't let this impact me when it came to the evidence being presented, I'd be lying if I said it didn't affect me on a personal level both during and after the trial. John lost his life, a tragedy regardless of what other events may or may not have taken place, and I often felt like that aspect was forgotten amid the trial. Breaking away from the interview, I agree that when I first heard about this case, I couldn't even tell you which news outlet I watched and heard about this case, but it was through a news outlet. I'm not on social media at all, not anymore. I was a couple years ago, but I'm not on any social media. The only social media I use, the only platform I use truly is YouTube. And so I heard about this case through YouTube. And when I heard about John, the manner that was alleged, how John died or was killed, it didn't make sense to me. But when I heard the defense's argument, that their theory that it was a setup, that Karen Reed was framed, and that John had actually sustained injuries inside 34 Fairview, that seemed to make more sense to me on my own, without hearing any other theories, without hearing any other sources. On my own, just watching that news report, I immediately felt like that seemed more likely. And the fact that it seemed more likely really tore me up. Because to me, what does it take for people to do that to someone? It takes cruelty. It takes psychopathy. It takes selfishness. It takes not caring about human life. And anytime people don't care about human life, whether the person is good or bad, whether the person was a saint or a sinner, anytime people don't care about human life, it tears me at the core. I'm sensitive to these topics, to people, especially when people die from deeply cruel means, like a level of cruelty that only psychopaths would have. And that's how I perceived it from the very beginning, that it took a level of cruelty to do to John what happened to John. That not only was he beat up, not only did he sustain dog bites and dog claw marks, but then his body was placed outside so that he could keep dying, and he would freeze to death. And if we remember, the medical examiner said that he ultimately died from hypothermia, from exposure to cold temperatures. That if he had just been picked up sooner, if somebody had just transported him to the hospital sooner, he might still be here today. But he was left deliberately dying on the lawn, and it was absolutely a cover-up on top of it. Like the Alberts and the McCabes and Higgins and the paramedics who were friends with them, they all lied. They all worked together to cover this up, despite John having already suffered immensely, horrifically. He suffered enough, and then after his death, People lied. Like, so many people lied, and so many members of law enforcement, so many members of first responders lied as to how he died, as to what caused his death. They all lied to cover it up. So he was tortured, he was beaten, and he was left outside to freeze to death so that he couldn't say what actually happened to them. So that, because dead man can't tell you what happened to them. And I feel that the Alberts and the McCabes and Higgins knew this. They knew that John O'Keefe could not survive. They would not let him survive so that he could not tell the world what actually happened to him. And again, just how Jennifer McCabe delayed bringing Karen Reed to his body. Jennifer McCabe was buying time, driving around with Carrie Roberts and Karen Reed. Like, there is no way Jennifer McCabe left 34 Fairview and did not see John O'Keefe's body, if we believe the prosecution's narrative. So I'm just saying there's a level of evil there. There's a level of cruelty there that makes me angry. And it makes me want to cry simultaneously, that people can be this fucked up. And it makes me want to help. It makes me want to be part of the justice for John O'Keefe and be part of Free Karen Reed. Okay, next question. What did you think of Judge Cannone? Do you feel like she was partial to the Commonwealth with her rulings or demeanor during testimony? The answer is, she was kind to us. She always made a point to remind us to stand up and stretch during sidebars. She kept to the schedule for breaks and lunch like clockwork, and she reminded everyone, emphasis on everyone, to keep their voices up so we could leave the AC on. It got hot in the jury box, ! Sitting in a chair listening to testimony all day is very different from real life. You need to be attentive to catch everything, and you can't just get up and move around whenever you want to. It sounds pretty silly unless you experience it, but it's very different when you can't just get up to get a snack, use the bathroom, take a brain break, or get some air anytime you want to. Of course, when we asked for breaks, there was never any pushback, but we were also cognizant of the need to keep things moving. At times, I did feel there was a level of professionalism that wasn't being maintained, and that the severity of the circumstances was not always at the forefront. It bothered me when there was an objection, and her response was, quote, "I'll let them have it," end quote. And this is in bold font. I think there was some bias against the defense, particularly Mr. Jackson. Yeah, there absolutely was. The answer continues, but I also think there were times she was hard on Mr. Lally, particularly when it came to repeating questions about well-established things already made clear throughout prior testimony. There were times I would glance over and wonder if she is paying attention, but to some extent I can understand that it was hard to stay focused. I struggled with this myself, mainly if it was something we had already seen or heard 8 times, like the weather report, the layout of the waterfall, bar, etc. And pulling away from the interview, it's true. So much of what Adam Lally, the prosecutor, presented was almost intentionally boring. It was intentionally, it was as if Adam Lally was also buying time. He regurgitated so many things. He went over so many things over and over and over again. The weather especially, we all remember that. As if to put the focus on the weather, she did this, she knew the weather was coming. And to be fair, people, there are cases in which murders took place because the culprit, the person committing the crime, knew that the weather was going to be bad, and they knew that it would be a perfect opportunity to kill someone and make it look like it was the weather that killed them. There are so many cases, crime cases, where that has happened in the US. There's a snowstorm coming. Let's kill this person and make it look like they froze to death in the snow. That has happened countless times in the US, to be fair. And it seems like that was Adam Lally's go-to. It was his MO during the Karen Read trial. He wanted everyone's attention on the weather. So like everyone knew it was going to be a snowstorm. Everyone knew it was going to be a blizzard. And I can't stand it when they describe it as a blizzard, because Massachusetts gets snow, it gets nor'easters, but to me it like seldom gets blizzards. To me, what happened on January 28th into January 29th, 2022 was a snowstorm, not a blizzard. But they make it seem like it was like Antarctica or something, right? Okay, so I'm just saying, like, I distinctly recall Adam Lally like repeating over and over again the snow, the weather, and it was exhausting and it was boring. And it just proves that he's an extremely weak prosecutor. I've seen some excellent prosecutors. Adam Lally is not one of them. John O'Keefe deserved more than Adam Lally. Next question. Was it hard to stay awake and focus during some of the Lally questioning of witnesses? The answer is, what, if anything, can I really say about this? You were there. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. And that's how Adam Lally will forever be. He will forever be Adam, what, if anything, Lally. Okay, next question. What witnesses did you find most compelling? The answer is the medical examiner. I felt she was a straight shooter and gave her medical opinion based on the facts. There was no point where I felt her opinion had been influenced by either the Commonwealth or the defense to fit a theory being presented. She was the medical examiner who testified on behalf of the state of the Commonwealth. She was compelling, and it did seem like she did not want to just go along with what Adam Lally was trying to make her do. She seemed to have a backbone, unlike the McCabes and the Alberts and Higgins, who have zero backbone. They just go along with whatever the power structure tells them to do, i.e. Brian Albert and Chris Albert and Kevin Albert. Whereas the medical examiner, to me, she tried to stay true. She tried to remain, like, she tried to have integrity in her testimony, and I respected her for that. Next question. Who do you think was the most pointless witness? That's a good question. The answer reads, pointless, the two women that were in Aruba with John and Karen a few weeks prior to January 29th. Unnecessary, John's niece and nephew. I didn't see any reason why the children were brought into a courtroom to testify after all they had been through. It could be that they wanted to be heard, but it felt wrong to have them on the stand with everyone watching. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, I agree. And we didn't get to hear their testimony, the niece and nephew, because they were minors, but their testimony was provided to transcripts. And to me, like, the niece and nephew didn't prove or disprove anything. Like, it was not unnecessary. There wasn't anything groundbreaking that the niece and nephew provided in their testimony. If anything, they reassured everyone that Karen Read and John O'Keefe together provided a family unit for the niece and nephew. They had a family unit, and it was just unfortunately falling apart closer to John O'Keefe's death, to when it happened. It was falling apart. There were trust issues in the relationship, and whenever there are trust issues in a relationship, it tends to fall apart. It's human nature, and it happens all the time. But I do love what the jurors said about the two women that were in Aruba. And I mean, we could all tell that they were biased against Karen Read, just Yeah, there were so many witnesses, really, in this trial who wasted everyone's time. They really did. The state, the prosecution, Michael Morrissey, he wasted a lot of people's time. Next question. Brian Albert, Brian Higgins, and Michael Proctor all greeted the jury and thanked them after their testimony. What did you think about that? The answer is these three men were a huge focal point of the trial. So while I wish I could have taken it as nothing more than a polite gesture, I did not. Interesting. So while I could have taken it as nothing more than a polite gesture, I did not. I wish the juror would have divulged more about that. The next question is, did you find Brian Albert's story believable about not waking up to come outside? That's a really good question. The answer is, I was very torn on this throughout the trial. On one hand, I can understand being pretty drunk, going to bed late, and being deep asleep to the point where nothing wakes you up. But I also find it hard to believe that a first responder's instincts, which are ingrained and become part of who they are over the course of their career, had this much commotion on his front lawn, and those instincts didn't kick in at any point. Exactly. Yeah. For both of them, for Brian Albert and for Nicole Albert to not come outside at all. Like they said, John O'Keefe never went inside the house. They said Colin Albert was never there, or Colin Albert was there briefly but left before anything happened to John. And despite all the commotion, and despite Jennifer McCabe calling Nicole Albert and Nicole Albert answering Jennifer McCabe's phone, even though Nicole Albert lied about answering Jennifer McCabe's phone call, Nicole Albert still couldn't go outside. Brian Albert still couldn't go outside. To me, everything Nicole Albert and Brian Albert did that morning and after that morning, during trial, their testimony, everything they have done at the core is them avoiding what they did, them avoiding responsibility as homeowners. They were completely avoidant, evasive in taking any responsibility. Consistently, if you just look at all of their actions, Brian and Nicole Albert, the married couple who owned 34 Fairview, if you just look at all of their actions and all of their statements, they are evading personal responsibility in every possible fucking way they can. And if they just say John O'Keefe never went inside the house, and if they just say they slept through all of that, slept through all the fire trucks, the paramedics, the ambulance, the police officer, if they just slept through it all, then they had no part in it. If John O'Keefe never went inside the house, then they had no part in it. How convenient, right? How fucking convenient. And that their own fucking dog, Chloe, would leave her evidence on John O'Keefe's body. But they still, Brian and Nicole Albert, still will not take any responsibility. There's just too much there as homeowners for them to have gotten away with all of it, for them to have an answer to everything, and every answer they provide removes any personal responsibility as homeowners. It's enraging. Next question. What did you think of Jennifer McCabe's testimony? I found Jennifer McCabe to be very combative, which was off-putting. Her demeanor made it difficult to process anything she was saying. Something felt off when she continued to ask to be reminded of statements, events, etc., with evidence of her prior accounts. It felt like she needed reminders of what she had previously said before she answered to keep from contradicting herself. Amen. I'm going to read that last sentence again. It felt like she needed reminders of what she had previously said before she answered to keep from contradicting herself. Amen. Jennifer McCabe and Matt McCabe both used this this tactic during their testimonies. Like, they wanted to see the original report, but it wasn't to refresh their memory. It was because they had lied so much that they wanted to see the report to make sure they didn't fuck up the next lie. And I'm grateful that the jurors, that this jury member in particular, saw it. She saw right through Jennifer McCabe's BS. Next question. What did you think of Michael Proctor's testimony? Michael Proctor was mentioned every single day of this trial, so to say he was someone I was anxiously waiting to hear from would be an understatement. I was obviously disappointed that an officer of the law behaved in a way that showed so little integrity and didn't uphold their oath to protect and serve our community. While I did not agree with a lot of his behavior when it came to the investigation and understand that said behavior was a critical part of the trial for the defense, I wish it hadn't come down to reading texts in open court where he essentially dehumanized Karen. None of that had anything to do with the core facts of the case, but it was a bit eye-opening to hear how investigations are discussed amongst some of our law enforcement. There were many things that didn't add up in his testimony, but that can be said for other witnesses as well. This is in bold print. I felt it hurt the Commonwealth that the lead investigator wasn't there to testify solely about the outcome of the investigation, but to testify about his actions throughout the investigation. That's a really good answer. That's really compelling, too. From a juror, like this is how a juror is perceiving the case. They're perceiving the trial. And that it hurt the Commonwealth that Massachusetts State Trooper Michael Proctor was such a jerk, such an a-hole in his text messages and his correspondences that he absolutely objectified and dehumanized Karen Reed, that it became such a huge distraction from the prosecution's narrative. For your lead investigator to have been this biased against the suspect from the beginning, and for the lead investigator to be so sure that she was going to get locked up, and to be so sure that because Brian Albert was an officer, nothing was going to happen to him. Yeah, like it was revealing of the arrogance and of the psychopathy of so many members of law enforcement involved. And they are psychopaths. I'm not a doctor, but they are psychopaths. If you're going to intentionally cover something up like this and play a role in the cover-up and play a role in hating someone you don't even know, play a role in framing someone because you want to protect your cop friends, then you are a psychopath. And you're going to hell. You are absolutely going to hell. Next question. Did you find Colin Albert's testimony believable? The answer is, I found Colin to be purposely elusive when asked questions that he was prepared for. But when it came to the questions he was not prepared for, the cracks in his testimony started to show. I think we can all agree that none of us has ever slipped on ice while holding a solo cup and broken our fall with just our knuckles. That was a great answer. Yeah. Colin Albert absolutely was involved in a fight. He was absolutely involved in a fight. And to me, it's perfectly reasonable for the masses, myself included. It's perfectly reasonable for us to believe that Colin Albert had a role in how Officer John O'Keefe sustained injuries to his face, particularly above his eye, which were indicative of him having been punched. And for Colin Albert to have wounds on his fists not long after this, not long after January 29th. To me, it's telltale. And again, in any other case, in any other crime case, the fact that Colin Albert had wounds to his fists, fight wounds to his fists, would have made him a suspect. In any other case, but because Colin Albert is Chris Albert's son, Chris Albert being a select board member for the town of Canton, Colin Albert was unscathed. Everyone lied for him, including the homeowner, Nicole Albert. She absolutely lied for Colin Albert. She protected her brother-in-law's son. She protected her nephew, Colin Albert. She absolutely did. Next question. Did you believe Colin Albert was inside Brian Albert's house? The answer is, I know that at some point Colin Albert was in the house. That was proven beyond a reasonable doubt. But whether he was there past the time he stated is not as clear. This one is in bold print. I do put weight on Allie McCabe seeming to slip up during the part of her testimony where she stated that Colin wasn't in the house when John was. I could believe that is the truth, but that statement also put John in the house, which is something the Commonwealth has said did not happen. And again, the Celebrite data, the actual cell phone expert, said that John O'Keefe entered the house. He absolutely entered the house, and he absolutely descended and or ascended steps in the house. Stairs. And that was a slip up from Allie. It was a slip up. And the internet went wild when that slip up happened. That Colin wasn't there when John was there. So Allie knew that John was there. Right. And to think about all the young people that were there, the 17, 18, 20-year-olds, these are kids just beginning their lives. They are just figuring out who they are. They're figuring out what they're going to do for the rest of their lives. And the idea to think about that their parents put them up to this, that their parents likely coached them into lying about how a human being was killed while they were all there to witness it. And we may never know what Allie saw, what Colin did, what the other kids saw that were in the house. They may never tell the world. They may want to protect their families till the end of time. But to me, it's not fair for the adults in the house to put that much weight on their children. If in fact that's what happened. And to me, at least a few of the kids of their children, the McCabes and the Alberts, their children, at least a few of them, Colin and Allie especially, they must be lying. And to think that there were other young people there, other teenagers, young 20-year-olds there, and that they too were put up to lying. They were put to the task to lie, to save Nicole and Brian Albert's asses. Like, to me, that's not fair. To do that to a young person who is just starting their life, who is just figuring out who they are. And now they have to live with this massive elephant of a lie for the rest of their lives in order to stay and remain a part of the family. Again, that's dark. I keep referring to the Alberts and the McCabes and Higgins as dark, but it's the most fitting word to me. It is so dark. It's like hell. They created a hell, and everyone that lied for them, they are part of that hell. They are part of that darkness. Next question. Do you believe Katie McLaughlin's testimony that Karen Reed said, quote, "I hit him at the scene that morning"? The answer is, I believe Katie McLaughlin believes she heard this, whether it be from her own memory or what she was reminded she heard. However, I did find it hard to believe that of all the first responders on the scene that morning, she was the only one to hear that statement. But at the same time, there was a lot of conflicting testimony from first responders of what they heard or saw that morning. I didn't put any more weight on this testimony than any other testimony related to what people heard or saw that morning. Interesting response. But that's a good point, and I'm glad the juror could point that out, that she found it hard to believe that of all the first responders on the scene that morning, she was the only one to hear that statement. Yeah. And remember, did Katie put it down anywhere? Did she write it down on any of her notes? Did she give those notes to the prosecution or the defense? Like, no. You're really going to hear someone supposedly confess to a crime, confess to having caused someone's death, and you're not going to write it down? You're not going to write it down, Katie. I think Katie's a liar. And I think Katie shouldn't be a first responder either. I think every member of law enforcement, the judge, the prosecutor, the lawyer, all the lawyers that lied, all the members of law enforcement who lied, and all the first responders who lied, they all need to be fired. They all need to be removed from their positions because they should not be in the care of any human being ever again. Next question. Did you believe Lucky Loughran's testimony? Lucky Loughran is a very likable man, as is his boss, Michael Trotta. Lucky's testimony appeared to be truthful. It didn't seem he had an agenda, but that he just wanted to share what he knew. And I agree. And I think the internet, wide and large, we all agreed that how could you not like Lucky? How could you not appreciate his objective, impartial testimony? And he was very matter of fact. And he seemed like such a chill dude. He wasn't out to frame anybody. He wasn't out to be evasive about any questioning. He wasn't out to lie about cell phone data or to tell you to believe him over the cell phone data or to tell you to believe him over the video evidence. He was just there to tell you what he witnessed that night as a snowplow driver who had been plowing 34 Fairview for many years and was well aware of who the McCabes and the Alberts were and was well aware of what kind of cars the Alberts had at 34 Fairview. He knew their cars. He was the perfect witness for this case. And we were all lucky. We were all fortunate to have witnessed Lucky's testimony. He truly is lucky. Next question. Did you feel deceived by the inverted Sallyport video? The answer is yes, very much so. The prosecution's emphasis on this video and its supposed significance is in proving beyond a reasonable doubt that nobody was near the damaged taillight was a primary focus throughout the trial. It was a shock to find out that what I believed I was seeing and what I was actually seeing were not one and the same. Yeah. I mean, on top of everything else, on top of the lies, how many so-called witnesses were proven to be liars through cell phone data. They were proven to be liars and by contradicting their own stories, by forgetting their own lies, they were proven to be liars. But on top of that, they inverted the Sallyport video. They inverted it. And rather than pretending that they were never near that taillight, it was proven that they were all over in that taillight. and that they absolutely had the opportunity to mess with the evidence, to manipulate and plant evidence, which is exactly what they did. The next question. Did the jury have any idea about the federal investigation? If not, what did you think Ryan Nagel was talking about when he said he spoke to the feds? What did you think all the references to the, quote, other proceedings witnesses testified at were in reference to? The answer is, perhaps others caught on, but I honestly had no idea. I missed Ryan Nagel mentioning the feds during his testimony, and I assumed the other proceedings were another grand jury or something like that. I had no reason to think there was something as big as a federal investigation going on outside of the trial. Interesting. The next question. Do you feel deceived not being told about the feds? The answer is, I don't think I would use the word deceived, but I would say misled. Wow. The answer continues. Looking back, not knowing the entire scope of what was happening and not having what seemed to be crucial information likely hindered my ability to see the whole picture. If I had known the full scope, the ARCCA witnesses would have made more sense. The things I thought were important may not have been where I focused my attention, and I may have looked at some witness testimony differently. Exactly. And remember, folks, the prosecution had access to the same witnesses from ARCCA, the two doctors who came from ARCCA, the biomechanical engineer and the accident reconstructionist. The prosecution had access to both of them, and the prosecution could have used them as part of their presentation, but they did not, because they absolutely knew that the ARCCA experts, the real experts from ARCCA, would have thrown the prosecution's narrative out the fucking window. That's who the prosecution truly are. Michael Morrissey, Adam Lally. That's who they truly are. They are not true prosecutors. They are purveyors. They are enablers of the toxic state, of the toxic members of law enforcement, of the corruption and the tyranny that surrounds and makes up Norfolk County in Massachusetts. That's who Adam Lally is, and that's who Michael Morrissey is. They're not actually out for justice. They're not about prevailing justice. They are about prevailing BS and their power, and keeping those they want in power, like Brian Albert and Nicole Albert. For whatever reason, Michael Morrissey wants to protect them. So I'm just saying, if the prosecution was truly about the truth, truly about justice, they would have brought the ARCCA experts on the stand. It wouldn't have been the defense that had to do it. And if the defense never did it, if the defense never called the ARCCA experts, then the world would have never heard from them during trial. It's like think of it. If the prosecution brought on the experts from ARCCA, what would have happened? What would have happened? I'm sure the jury members would have been like, what are we doing here? What is all this? What was the point of this trial? What are we doing here? Next question. How could anyone on that jury think that Karen Reed hit John with her car after hearing from the ARCCA guys? The answer is, I can only speak for myself, but you have to understand that we were not told where these witnesses came from. There was a lot of conflicting testimony throughout the trial, specifically regarding IT and accident reconstruction, quote, experts. I understood that neither the Commonwealth nor the defense hired them, but I had no idea where they came from. For all I knew, they were two very smart and well-educated people who read about the case online and decided to analyze what happened. I found them credible, but there were things they weren't aware of that I thought were important, and I couldn't understand why they were testifying when they didn't seem to have all the information. The positioning of their presence and the information they had been provided to analyze was strange, no doubt, but being hired by the FBI or any other agency never crossed my mind. And you guys will remember that when the accident reconstructionist from ARCCA was testifying, he said that the evidence, quote, the evidence was confusing to follow, end quote. That's what he said. The evidence was confusing to follow. And the state, he got the evidence from the state. Like, they asked for the evidence and the state gave them evidence, and the evidence the state gave them wasn't very much. And yet they were still able to disprove the prosecution's narrative. They were still able to say with full certainty that Karen Reed never did it, that John O'Keefe was never hit by an SUV. But I've heard this argument online from a few of the trolls, the anti-Karen Reed people. They have said the experts from ARCCA didn't even have all the evidence. They didn't even have all the information. Yeah, why not, though? Because the state kept them from having all of the evidence, and the state didn't even have real evidence. Evidence was planted. Videos were inverted. Cell phone data was completely ignored. And ARCCA was still able to prove that John O'Keefe was never hit by the Lexus SUV. That's how shitty the prosecution's narrative was. That's how filled with holes their narrative was. That even with minimal evidence, true experts were able to discern and see right through it. Next question. How did you feel about Brian Albert being in court for closing deliberations? I felt it was inappropriate. He was a key witness and a major focal point during the trial, so I don't think he should have been allowed in the courtroom at any time other than during his testimony. This goes for Jennifer McCabe and Colin Albert as well. Yeah. I'm really glad that this juror said that. It was inappropriate. It was inappropriate, and again, to me it just shows Brian Albert's narcissism. Brian Albert is absolutely a narcissist. Again, I don't need to be a doctor to know that. Brian Albert is absolutely a malignant narcissist. Not just a narcissist, a malignant narcissist, a dangerous narcissist who will allow someone to suffer a horrific death on his own property, and then he will sit with the family of the victim, the O'Keefes. He will sit with them and then face the jury during closing arguments. That's a malignant narcissist right there. He will commit serious, heinous acts, take zero responsibility despite those acts having been committed on his own property. And then he will sit with the victim's family. I am so sure John O'Keefe was rolling, turning over in his grave, while Brian Albert was sitting with John O'Keefe's family. Next question. Did you feel that a, quote, not guilty verdict for Karen on the manslaughter charge implied that the McAlberts were somehow responsible? The answer is, this is a tough one to answer. Human nature is to want to be Perry Mason and solve the case, and I wasn't exempt from that. I had times during the trial where I would think, if this isn't what happened, then what did happen? As the weeks went on, I realized that my job wasn't to solve the case, but to focus on the one possibility that was being presented to me. So no, I didn't feel that a not guilty verdict for Karen implied that any of the Alberts or McCabes were responsible. Having been back in the real world for some time now, I see that it's very likely the public would have perceived it precisely that way, though. Interesting. Very, very interesting from the juror. And I'm going to read this last question. And again, I'll leave the link to the website in the description below if you guys want to keep reading the questions and the answers. So I'm going to end it at question 29. It reads, how long did the jury take to reach a unanimous not guilty verdict on the murder charge? What was discussed during deliberations that made some jurors change their vote from not guilty to guilty for manslaughter? The answer is, given that motions on counts 1 and 3 remain outstanding, I don't believe anyone should discuss this at this time. Anything related to deliberations and their outcome should be kept inside the courtroom. Actually, I do want to read question 30, and then I'll stop it right there. Okay. Question 30 reads, now that you've had time to research the case post-trial, what have been some of the most surprising things to learn about? And the answer reads, the amount of people who are invested in this case. I went into this not knowing what a following it had and how much it had taken over social media, podcasts, etc. The federal investigation was also a huge surprise. A lot of things made more sense after learning that. Interesting. That's pretty cool. It's interesting to see like how a juror feels about the case after the case, and how a juror feels finally having access to the internet, to the TV, to finally being able to learn what people are thinking about this case, whereas the juror was not permitted to do so during trial. So that it is interesting to see their perspectives here, and to sort of have an inside look of what was going through their minds during trial. So anyway, again, I'll leave the link to Aidan Kearney's website in the description below, and I hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching.